Greetings, stranger, and welcome to Ghastly Tales. When a man of my sort reaches this age, he begins to gaze backwards into the dwindling archives of memory, taking stock of all that was, and perhaps most keenly, of all that might have been. Anyone who sees me, bent and gnarled as an oak, leaning on a stick to move about, my skin wrinkled like an old suit, well, none could be faulted for thinking I am as old as a man can get around here, and a bit older even than that. The stone cottage is all I have but memories. But what memories! And this view, I step out my front door and the cold salt air assaults me like an angry lover's slap. I could throw a rock from this cliff into the sea below, and have done so many a time, if only to hear her echo, reminding me that she at least endures of all I have known and loved and lost. As a young man, I built this house up out of the rubble and the ruin of the great citadel that went before it, a fortress far older than this little shadow of mine. That's what I think about most these days, that big old stone house between the moor and the mists and the sea, and those who lived there. And what happened on that impossible day so long ago. For that I remember very, very well. The people of our village said the ancient dwelling was cursed, and some swore it wasn't even a natural house at all, and if it hadn't been called up out of the whispers of preternatural history, they'd have razed her to the ground and thrown her inhabitants into the sea. I saw this as nothing but bluster, the idle chattering of a frightened people of no great imagination, giving vent to their deepest slumbering fears. In 1795, the summer of my 12th year, we moved to these desolate lands from town, where we had a lovely house with many servants, and my sisters and I had everything we desired, and our parents were always happy. But things took a dark turn that year, as we gathered around our worldly possessions, hastily shoved into boxes, those not carried off by debtors or sold, and amidst my mother's copious tears, Father explained to us how our circumstances had changed, and that we must now make do as best we could. I soon fully understood what that meant. In a word, we had become poor, and would live out our impoverished existence in a mere rustic's cottage, far from the nearest peasant village. My sisters and I occupied a tiny room at the back of the house that we shared with firewood and potatoes. There was a stone hearth for cooking and staying warm, and we said our sad goodbyes to happiness and all the things of the world that we had known. The one bright spot in our new world was that there were no tutors or nurses or nannies curbing our adventures, and we were left alone for long periods of time to do as we wished. My sisters hated our cottage and the cold, barren lands that threatened without remorse to swallow us whole, and they soon made friends with girls from the small village and were seldom seen except for mealtimes. These were always sad little gatherings, steeped in bitterness and regret, and consisted of little more than bread and potatoes and silence. 3 days a week, I was required to attend the little schoolhouse in the village. The very day I first appeared at the school, my young peers wasted no time initiating me into the local mythos by describing in elaborate detail the old dark house and its mysterious inhabitants. They also warned me to stay far away from it if I knew what was good for me. I remembered the witch that lived on our street in town, The children dared each other to knock on her front door and then run like the devil himself was after them. The old woman only came out at night to avoid this abuse and was always wrapped in layers of velvet and crinoline, and all you could see of her face behind the lace veil was two red, glowing eyes. That was accurate enough, I suppose, except for the glowing red eyes. My mother said she was just a sad old widow who'd gone mad after her husband and only child had perished when a streetlight burst and drenched them in flaming oil. Being very enlightened for my age, I put no stock in this type of childish tongue-wagging. I did, however, resolve at the first opportunity to look myself upon that house on the cliff overlooking the sea and make the acquaintance of its inhabitants. Since our hovel was at the edge of the moor, it was not a long walk to that house, where I could prove to my own satisfaction the truth or fancy of these miraculous reports. Of course, my mother had forbidden me to go anywhere near the place, more out of fear I might fall to my death than any sinister and inexplicable fate that might befall me. So one afternoon, I set out with purpose across the moor. Soon enough, that stark behemoth rose to challenge my advance through the rolling fog and forced me to pause, frozen in my tracks. It was not like any house, hovel, manse, or castle I had ever laid eyes upon, and I could see how it might instill frightful notions in the minds of my young peers. Its mammoth bulk was all of a damp green stone, with 4 impossibly tall, jagged towers rising sharply from its upper floors like an infernal crown. There were 2 or 3 large outbuildings of the same sort that I took to be stables. The house itself was darkened, with only one room on the ground floor alight with a pale, flickering glow, and in one of the nest of towers. I had no intention of approaching that looming fortress and making my presence known, nor any desire to knock upon that carved black door and call forth whomever might lay in wait within. Nor did I wish to retrace my steps like a cowardly whelp without some proof of my visit, some hint of the inhabitants and the truth of this place that lay so far from the rest of mankind, with the sea its only companion. I went around to the back of the house, where a small window on the ground floor beckoned my implacable curiosity. I climbed up, clung to the stone lip of the place, and peeked inside. But nothing revealed itself in the gloom. The creak of a shutter opening wide above my head and the sound of someone clearing their throat caused me to let out a shriek, and I slipped on the rank mossy stone and fell flat on my back. The face that peered down at me was that of a girl, about my age, with the most singular face I had ever seen. Gaunt and ghastly thin, with a sickly glow as grey as the mists that floated past her, like hair on the drowned. That captivating face with deep-set eyes swept over me like a lamp, peering down from a great height, her long tresses dangling out of the window. I could not tell for the life of me if this was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen, a siren, a nymph, a maenad or angel, or the face of deepest delirium and inescapable nightmare. "You best come inside right away. You might be hurt," she said, in a voice that echoed with the roar of the tides. Then the window shut silently above me, and I paused for a heartbeat as the heavy, worm-eaten door opened slowly. I did not know as I scrambled to my feet and ran for my life back towards home, if anyone or anything was in pursuit. I reached our cottage unscathed by further mishap or mystery, and stumbled through the door completely out of breath to find my parents and sisters already seated at the table, taking their evening meal. I slammed the door behind me, as if that gesture alone could somehow bar the denizens of unseen worlds from our midst. "What in blazes?" roared my father, as he stood up and threw his napkin onto the table. "Wherever have you been?" my mother barked at me. Well, sit down and eat. No more coming in late like this, or we will not hold your supper. You had better not have been spying on that house," she added sharply, glaring at me with a near infallible mother's intuition. I ate in silence, and went to the loft my father had prepared for me when my sisters said they no longer wanted a boy in their midst. I was glad for this private sanctum, and retired here every night with my lamp and my books. But on this night, I could neither read nor sleep, and the memory of the girl banished every other thought and became more tangible and commanding with each passing moment. Even as a young boy, I was given to flights of wondrous fancy, and night-time was when it broke through completely and held court, I its eager supplicant. I used to get up and wander about the cottage at night, hoping to see my father's lamp still lit or a candle at my mother's bedside burning low. This always made me feel safe, like the wholesome forces of day and reason still held back the teeming darkness that lapped hungrily at my small window, begging entry. By the time the sun broke through the cracks in the wall above my head, I was possessed by the sole truth and purpose of my being. I would venture back to that abysmal fortress that very day and confront the strange girl and coax from her the secret she must surely hold. She was a young girl, after all, and as such we shared a kinship, a common world known only to those of our age. Indeed, as I told myself, she would welcome any advances I might bring to her lonely solitude, and soon she and I will become the fastest of friends. I would then taunt the other boys at school with the promise of forbidden knowledge, and so I went through my day, fueled by the excited vision of the plan to be enacted and the ambitions I would soon bring to fruition. With my chores behind me, I slipped out of the house and made my way over the cold moor, and soon that rising, haunted edifice emerged fully into view. I walked up to the front door, planning to knock boldly with the iron ring of mysterious design and utter what words I was still gathering in my head. Before I reached that frightful portal to unknown wonders, it swung open without a sound, like a hungry orifice, and I was met with the vision of an unnaturally tall, emaciated woman, buttoned up collar to toe in crisp black linens, her grey hair coiled tightly about her head like a massive nest of serpents about to writhe about menacingly. She glared down at me, hands clasped firmly against her waist, large, round, flat eyes, set too broadly across the surface of her face to be attractive, and the disturbingly full-lipped mouth pulsating rhythmically like a wound. I didn't have the chance to turn and run for my life before the girl I sought peeked around the women's skirts and spoke in that captivating echo of a voice that had impaled my sleepless night. "Nurse, bring this boy inside. We will play in my rooms," she said as the nurse stepped aside and guided me into the vast front hall of that vast spectral domain. It seemed to take a lifetime for me to fully cross the threshold, as the shadows scattered like insects into the deeper darkness as we waded among them. We passed several barely lit or darkened rooms, some thick with voices that hushed as we passed, unblinking eyes peering back at me while the persons within remained otherwise concealed. The reek of the place, that of the mouldering earth of the cemetery or charnel house, caused me to instinctively cover my nose and mouth with my hand. I learned the girl's name was Alexandra McBloodbane Pickman, that her father, an artist of some nefarious renown, was legendary for his uncanny depictions of the horrors of the pit, seldom achieved outside of delirium and the abandoned catacombs of the asylum. All this was explained to me as we climbed the winding stairs that led upwards, higher and higher, into that charnel abode, where the very walls shrank from my gaze as from probing fingers. We finally crossed the top floor, and Nurse followed silently as we entered a vast, cavernous suite. Then she closed the door and retreated silently back into the house. Alexandra motioned for me to sit in one of the several large, black leather chairs as she clambered into the bed and regarded me as though I was as strange a creature to behold as she was to me. We gazed at each other, and I noticed that her flesh had an unhealthy, mottled hue, and I wondered what obscure sickness might infest this house. Yet I remained transfixed, a willing captive before this girl. Then I finally got up the nerve to examine more closely my surroundings. It was a very large room for a young girl, but typical of old dwellings and their aristocratic inhabitants. But here was every wonder unimaginable on display, unidentifiable curios of countless variety and indiscernible purpose, ornately carved masks of ancient design depicting creatures both known and fantastical gazed down upon me as bookshelves to the ceiling vied for attention, and funerary statuary unaccustomed to the indoors looked on with evident disdain. As one in a trance, my gaze was drawn slowly about the room, marveling at such an unlikely collection of miracula. I was vaguely aware of a pulsing melody coiling sinuously through the room, and realized it was a voice singing softly in a high-pitched warble that licked playfully at the recesses of my mind and caused me to tremble and recoil in disgust. I realized that the voice had meaning, and I listened as unbelievable tales unfolded before my inner eye, awakened as if from a forgotten dream by a voice that was like no human voice I had ever heard, nor were the words those of any human tongue. I witnessed the origins of this house, beyond the memory of human history, as it rose as a living thing from the earth, called up by a creature that was a man, yet no man ever of woman born. The creator of this unfathomable dwelling was a creature both dead and inflamed by a fierce life that brought forth dead things out of the mouldering soil to gather and coagulate in this house that breathed with an unimaginable quickness. I gazed upon this spectral being, half again the height of any natural man, and felt the undead eyes gaze back upon me, then lovingly upon his descendant, the girl curled up on the bed before me. I felt her mind warm to him, and call him grandfather. I knew he was a man of both hideous countenance and kindly, a thing I had no difficulty reconciling through Alexandra's mind. Hundreds upon hundreds of frightful tales and true crowded my brain as the denizens, heroes, and demoniac inhabitants of each more fearful and worrisome than the last related the details of their exploits to the accompaniment of frenzied drums that I knew was merely the beating of my own heart within my chest. I gritted my teeth and grabbed desperately at the arms of my chair as my ravaged mind clung fast to the quavering of Alexandra's voice, my only tether as the last fragments of sanity fled the onslaught. And yet the tempest of images and voices raged on, unabated. I beheld horses caparisoned for unholy battle, that were twice the size of any mortal steed and fashioned of raging flame and rotting corpses, animated by the sheer force of the grandfather's will, and I understood the nature of the vast stables I had seen. I saw a hideous but magnificent woman, the child of this man and the mother of my new friend, herself a thing of grey and gaunt visage, and I saw her mate, the fabled Richard Upton Pickman, a natural man no longer, as he travelled broadly and unchallenged through the realms of the unseen and of dream. That haunting, tenebrous voice caressed me as a cold, sweet hand, and I glimpsed briefly the person of Nanny slithering naked among the blackest depths of the sea, her dark, luminescent green body lithe and devoid of arms and legs. I marvelled inwardly at all that Nanny's austere garb on land must conceal, and her broad-lipped grimace and flat black eyes portend. Suddenly, with a start, I awakened, gasping for breath as icy lips pressed my own, and cold hands like the grave clutched mine. It was Alexandra who drew me from my reveries, a wan smile fading as our eyes met. I glanced toward the window, and I saw that it was dark outside, and though I was loath to leave this place of wonder and the girl I must now surely love as long as my life endured, I knew I had to get home or my parents would come looking for me, and that I could not countenance. I just sat there, unmoving, those strange, colourless eyes fixed upon me as I struggled to make sense of all I had seen and heard in that lilting song that made of me a captive moth to its beloved flame. It would require a lifetime of putting quill to parchment to record the many marvels that would shape my nightmares for the remainder of my life. With all the strength that remained to me, I leapt from the chair and bounded down the winding stairs and ran from that place, noticing with dread and relief that a small cart and horse raced across the moor after me, Nanny in the fore, grasping the whip and reins of a steed of dark fire, not unlike those that charged through my visions. I fled like a madman towards home, and arrived out of breath and sweating at my hovel. Flinging the door open, my sisters and mother jumped up, and as with one voice, fell back screaming in terror. I turned around to see what fell intruder had burst through the door on my heels, and saw my father leaping from his horse and barreling towards me, his face a twisted grimace of revulsion and his walking stick raised over my head. I knew I was late for supper, but this was beyond the pale for so good-natured a man as my father. And then I noticed the stooped and greying form of the man, the hunched shoulders, the wasting frame, and faded patched suit. And it was my turn to gasp. My mother and sisters were also drastically changed, my mother mirroring the shrunken, wizened form of my father, while my sisters had become greying spinsters. My father's hoarse voice uttered something of a guttural curse as he brought the stick down towards my head, in a rage as if to ward off the scion of hell himself. But his hand was stayed firmly by that of Nanny, who towered over him and then broke the stick in two and tossed it aside. My father stumbled away in grief, crossing himself and falling to his knees where he convulsed and emptied his stomach on the ground. I was stunned, but noticed Nanny gesturing angrily and knew she meant for me to climb into that ghastly cart and return with her back to the dark abode. I was too shocked to do anything but meekly comply, and soon we reached the house, and I was ushered as one in a stupor up those endless winding stairs, and back into the rooms of my Alexandra, where she put me to bed, and I slept for I know not how long. Time lost all meaning in that place, where I dwelled with Alexandra and her curious kin and numerous retainers. After countless early assaults upon my reason and natural senses, I realized there was nothing for me to fear in that house. Imperceptibly, things began to shift within me. Sights and sounds, at first both terrifying and captivating, became familiar, comfortable, even protective in their way. Nanny never uttered a single word to me, or relaxed her dour and forbidding stance on my presence. But then she never spoke to Alexandra either, or to anyone as far as I could see, and I wondered if perhaps her kind was without speech, taking her instructions through more subtle and arcane methods of communication. Alexandra's mother and her retinue never left her rooms in the uppermost regions of the fortress, and the whole household, but for me, dined with her nightly on a large terrace overlooking the west wing to the north and the sea beyond. Nanny procured food for me, I know not where, and I always dined alone. This too became the way of things, as life unfolded for me, day upon day as it does for any man. And a man I had indeed become, and my Alexandra as handsome a woman-like creature and as terrible to behold as any within these walls. I wondered about my parents and sisters, but it was clear I was no longer welcome among them, for reasons I did not then fully comprehend. Their rejection stung me to my core, though I did suffer vague suspicions when I recalled my father's ancient countenance, and the whole family's unbridled revulsion as their eyes fell upon me. I spoke of this to Alexandra, but soon the matter faded and was forgotten, as with all things of childhood. Alexandra's dread grandfather came and went with purpose daily, but seemed to prefer his stables and the warren of laboratories and private rooms he maintained there. It seemed the steeds of fire and corpse flesh were not the only impossible fabrications this ancient grandsire had fashioned in his equestrian domains, and the frequent, heavily cloaked and hooded arrivals from land and sea and air, who proceeded straight to grandfather's stables and left immediately thereafter on ships and covered caravans and other wholly unfamiliar vehicles, explained the vast stores of gold and silver and other treasure buried deep in subterranean catacombs beneath the house. One night, Alexandra revealed to me the secret of her own beginning. Her father, Pickman, had come to stay for a fortnight, and upon his departure, Alexandra shared with me, at his behest, the miraculous story of her birth. The grandsire had made a gift of a girl child to his daughter and her mate on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of their union. Just as he had fashioned the steeds of fire and rotting corpse in his laboratories, grandsire had secreted something from Alexandra's mother, a proud and haughty ghoul of the purest and oldest blood, and co-mingled it with a substance from Pickman's own curious biology. The legendary genius of grandsire and hundreds upon hundreds of years of experimentation had yielded the longed-for results, and my beloved Alexandra, both alive and never truly living, came screaming as a thing of wonder into this world. With time, the routines of our lives overshadowed my former existence. Alexandra and I spent our days and nights conversing in every possible topic in this world and those beyond. We indulged in unrestrained fanciful speculation and wrote poetry to each other and performed it aloud. We took long walks on the beach by moonlight or amidst the fog, and rode her grandfather's tamer steeds to places not of this earth. From time to time we visited Pickman in the lands of dream, but of these places and our adventures there I had but faint memory upon returning. We read and reread countless books in the many libraries of the house, and spent uncounted hours in silent reverie as I gazed into my beloved's eyes and longed for no other place than this by her side. I grew into full manhood, and it seemed no less than 15 years and more had surely passed as I floated through the airs and curiosities that was our world, thinking that eternity itself could pass unheeded and never encroach upon the dreams that filled our days. It was a shattering and incomprehensible nightmare then, when Alexandra came, and spoke to me one night after her sleep. She too was now fully grown, a magnificent ghoul with the countenance of a majestic human woman about her. I gazed unblinking as she described to me what was to come. Her mother, silently commanding this house and the adjacent lands and shadowy domains bordering it from her sequestered terrace suite, had come to a decision. She had always known, keeping close watch on her world and beyond as she did, that there would come a time when certain signs and portents would appear before her. Thus she would know that it was time for all this to end, when even the eternal house itself must crumble into the sea to escape prying of human eyes. Great Maman herself and grandsire and all their kin and loyal retainers would retreat into the sea and close off forever this portal to the netherworlds. Therein they would wait for the millennia to pass, or die within the cold black depths and be embraced by what awaits all beyond the final veil. Only Alexandra and I would escape this fate and disappear back into the world, while Alexandra's father, Pickman himself, pursued what unknown courses he found necessary and advisable to the satisfactory completion of his campaigns. I had no understanding of any of this, and when a short time later Alexandra and I stood upon the cliff and watched as her mother, tall-robed and crowned, arms raised aloft commanding the aethers from her terrace on high, sent the whole vast house tumbling like a child's toy into the sea, swallowing everything and every one inside. I wept bitter, silent tears, grasping Alexandra's hand for my very life. For her part, she just stood there, unblinking, as one in a trance, yet never raising the slightest protest, as her mother's decision was carried out in all its devastating finality before us. I have no idea how long we stood there, watching as the waters below swallowed the house and all of her inhabitants. And then it was gone from sight forever, except for a bit of rubble scattered on the beach below. When Alexandra squeezed my hand and drew me away from that place, I followed, eager to hear in what lands we would establish our new abode. She stood there, speaking to me, her words filling me with an anguish I had not known since the day my father had driven me off into the night with violent threats and curses. She was going away, she explained, alone, to look for her father within the lands of dream and seek his counsel. I protested, saying that I must accompany her, but she remained steadfast in her resolve to go alone, saying that she could not protect me, or indeed even herself, in the byways and far-flung places where she must seek her father if things went adrift of expectations. The deadly venom that seeped into my heart was not the chill of dead things or cold spectral hands. It was not the whisper of the uncanny or the portent of unknown worlds. It was grief. I turned and ran from her, having no idea where I could go when even my own family shunned me in disgust and outrage. I assumed my time away from human habitation had rendered me utterly unfit company for any wholesome hearthside or genteel table. As I fled over the moor toward my old house, determined to beg a grave sickness and beseech my parents to take me in and give me shelter, the otherworldly echoing of that tenebrous song overwhelmed me. Alexandra would return to me one day, she vowed, if she prevailed to survive in a recognizable form compatible with my own, and if her father gave her his leave. This caused my blood to surge with rage. Isn't that what they always said when they were leaving you forever behind and no longer desired the bother of your company? I steeled myself against the agony of Alexandra's decree while preparing for more insults and injury from my family. But I had nowhere else to turn. I came at last to my parents' hovel, but the place was nothing but a flattened earth. Even the rocks and bricks had been carted off, and of course there was no sign that my family, or anyone else among the living, had been there in a very long time. I studied the landscape and saw a sight in the distance that I could not explain. A dark winding ribbon lay across the gentle sloping hills, like a serpent slithering from sight into both horizons. I could see things speeding across its surface, and wondered if it was a sort of road. The things moving upon it were not carts and horses or carriages, but rather unrecognizable things of no visible means of propulsion. I walked the better part of a mile before I came to the bedevilled black road, and saw better the vehicles which sped past me so fast I could not make out their occupants. I stood beside that road and watched, and before long one of the vehicles halted before me, and a man looked out and asked me if I needed help. Then he glanced at his companions, and when they all got a closer look at me, they sped away, their wheels making a horrible screeching sound. I had no objection, of course, as I had no wish to talk to these men, and was not even sure I still possessed their speech. So I returned to the scant remains of Alexandra's dark fortress, where it lay in ruin upon the sands, and began the arduous task of dragging as much of it as I could back up to the top of the cliff, where I built up this mere shadow of our former domain. Among the remains on the beach, I found a fragment of mirror, but what I beheld in that mocking and unforgiving glass made me grimace and crush the thing into the dirt beneath my foot. In the course of time, I fashioned a safe and humble place within which to dwell amicably upon the land, and a solitary but comfortable existence. I fed, periodically, on the half-rotted offerings the sea cast upon the shore for my pleasure, and the occasional dead thing I found on my daily constitutionals over the moor, making sure to steer a wide path from any other dwellings, or the occasional sturdy walkers I might spy out and about. The only companion in this solitary life was the lonely, plaintive echo of creatures who made their home within the sea. I spent my sleepless nights along that deserted beach, basking in those distant songs, straining to hear if any sibilant cry or siren's call might be familiar to me of old. And thus I grew to become this old ruin of what was once a man. I eventually became obsessed with a singular desire to recall more fully all that I had known in life, and to take stock of all that was, and all that might have been had that old stone Leviathan, that dread manse that was my home for so long, that house between the moor and the mists and the sea, had not been exiled beneath the waves, and all her inhabitants but two gone silently into the cold black waters below with her. Had the quickening and natural elixirs of mortality remained within me, and the blood of my childhood coursed through these veins, I would have taken to the cliffs and flung myself into the sea many a time over the ensuing span of indiscernible time, not as my Alexandra's mother had done, but to bash this flimsy corpse upon the rocks below, and relieve myself of the tepid existence and sad memories that filled me with regret. I often crept dangerously close to that crag, indulging in the grim fantasy that I could do so any time I wished and end myself forever. I knew this was fruitless, as there was no natural way to end one such as myself, a thing transformed, revivified by my nearness to Alexandra and my time within that house, a thing known to men by the name ghoul. These changes I only regretted now that I was alone with naught to fill my misery but this startling metamorphosis. I did not know what hallmarks of natural aging could still befall me, as I advanced into old age and decrepitude. I knew at the core of my being, however, that such transformations as mine were peculiar to the creature I had become. My flesh had the reek and pallor of old meat, and at times chunks of it came away in my hands. This was remedied by a trip to the beach for a belly full of decaying offal from the sea, or other dead things I could find. And with each new discovery, I prayed that it was the last, and that my grotesque transmogrification was nearing its completion. Alas, there was ever more travesties of the flesh to be endured, and I longed more than ever to be rid of this existence that bound me captive to its tortuous and inscrutable whims. My hearing became ever more acute as well, and I could discern clearly not only the vehicles speeding past on the road a mile away, but the contents of their occupants' minds. The inaudible worrying from vehicles of solitary occupancy, unspoken plots both grandiose and banal, fleeting bits of conversation, whispered endearments, arguments, pleadings, threats, and sulking silence, all encroached upon my unnatural hearing, and threatened to drive me more irrevocably into madness than I already was. The only respite from this onslaught was to climb, monkey-like, hand over foot down to the beach and away from that inane and pitiful human chattering. Welcome though this peace and solitude was, I always had to return to my humble dwelling for what passed for sleep in the safety of my haven. Once I even searched among the sands for another fragment of mirror, as I had found long ago in the rubble of the great house. The gruesome countenance of my hands and lower limbs, now withered and green, did not bode well for what I might spy in a mirror, but I still craved some proof that all I feared to be true had indeed come to pass. I began to take long baths in the sea, and found therein some respite from my feebleness of limb. My sojourns among the waters, and ever deeper beyond the gentle lapping waves of the shore, came more frequently and with greater duration. I no longer left my lair during the daylight hours, and only emerged when the moon had risen to guide my path to the sea. When the moon did not appear, it was the mist and fog that lit my way, and brought me to that place within which I needed no guide. I lived then only to take to the sea, and feed upon what she offered me upon the sands. The thought of taking some living creature from the water and devouring it alive was utterly abhorrent to me, and I was content to subsist upon what was bequeathed to me by the generosity of Providence. In the spring, of what year I knew not, I was awakened by a quaver upon the night air that pierced my heart like a spear and regaled me with reminders of my pitiful state and the exile I endured with no recourse. As I lay upon my damp and ragged pallet in the darkness, the door of my hovel swung open, and the fog and chill wind flowed in and roused me from my fading slumber. I leapt up to a crouch, ready to spring upon the intruder and ravage him tooth and claw if I was able, or scramble away into the night if I was not. But the quavering voice stilled me like a master's hand to a cowering cur, and I fell back in disbelief as the tall, majestic creature strode through the door and took my hands, drawing me to my feet. It was Alexandra. I cursed aloud the apparition that haunted my decaying years, but she laughed and drew me near, though I shrank from her, not wishing to soil her garments with the stench and rottenness of my person, and dreading the vision of her recoiling from me in disgust. But no, with a firmness that brooked no dissent, she embraced me, and our eyes met as of old. My Alexandra, monstrous to behold, and so beautiful. She was as young as when she had departed for the lands of shadow in search of her father. She held firm my hands and sang her songs of old, reiterating her promise to return to me and renew our oath to one another. I shuddered, then pulled away, then warmed to the siren's lamp of her gaze and the touch of her cold flesh upon my own. She bade me look upon myself with her eyes, and raise my hands to my face and behold the greater mysteries of our bane existence. Indeed, though a creature wholly unlike the child of my birth, my flesh still pallid and putrescent was again as supple and unwrinkled as the last time my Alexandra and I beheld one another on that day of great calamity when all was lost. We embraced and laughed and held each other, as she chided me for my remorse and lack of faith in her. We went outside into the cold air, and I beheld the world anew. I did not even look back upon my dim and miserly little hovel, as the heavy mists parted, and the lands of dream rose silently to welcome us.